Anxiety doesn't discriminate. Anyone and everyone can develop issues with anxiety. Young, old, rich, or famous, it doesn't matter. In today's episode, we're going to talk about how one of the top YouTube creators in the world, Dhar Mann, developed anxiety and what he could have done to prevent it. Let's begin. Hey friend, Peter Wessels here with Fearless Anxiety. Before we get started, you should know that I suffered from debilitating anxiety for almost 2 years of my life. During that period, I experienced endless waves of anxiety, severe panic attacks, and just about every other symptom that anxiety can create. I felt like I was stuck in a body that was torturing itself, and I felt more terrified and alone than I ever thought possible. But I discovered the way out, and I fully recovered from my anxiety. I have now put that into a step-by-step format, which I call the 5-step cure to anxiety and panic attacks. And I put it in the link below. It's completely free, and it'll show you the steps that allow my clients to fully recover from their anxiety. All right, for those of you who don't know who Dhar Mann is, he's a YouTube creator with over 20 million subscribers, and each of his videos gets typically over 1 million views. But on a recent podcast on NPR's How I Built This, Dhar Mann revealed that he has suffered with anxiety and panic attacks. As he explained it, back on Christmas Day in 2022, he was sitting at his kitchen table doing some work on his laptop when, out of nowhere, it felt like it was hard for him to breathe, and his heart began beating really, really fast. So he quickly closed his laptop and began worrying that he was having some sort of medical emergency, like a heart attack. So he called his doctor and he explained the symptoms. And his doctor said, "It sounds like you're having a panic attack. And don't worry, you're going to be fine." But these panic attacks didn't stop. No, they continued for a month straight. In the podcast, Dhar Mann acknowledged that he had a terrible work-life balance at this time in his life, and that he was putting a huge amount of stress on himself to be successful with his business. He also acknowledged that he wasn't taking care of himself. He wasn't exercising, and he had a really poor diet. All right, so let's break that down. What Dhar Mann said was correct. The trigger to his panic attack was likely these things. It was the stress, the poor diet, and the lack of exercise that probably caused him to have the panic attack. The combination of these things caused his body to believe that something was wrong and that he was in danger. And so his body engaged its protective fight or flight response. What is the fight or flight response? Well, this response is our body's defense system. It engages when our body believes we are in danger, and it prepares our body to fight a threat or flee to safety. That's because historically, threats and dangers have been physical in nature. In other words, for our ancient ancestors, danger came in the form of things that could physically harm them. For example, it could be something like a wild animal, such as a lion or a tiger, or even an invading tribe. Those were the types of dangers that threatened their survival. And this meant that the fight or flight response was critical because it prepared their bodies to physically respond to that threat by releasing adrenaline and other stress hormones into their body so they could spring into action. But in today's world, physical dangers are rare for the vast majority of us. We thankfully don't have to worry about lions or tigers when we walk outside our homes. Instead, the dangers today are primarily psychological, like threats to our work, our family, or our finances. It's the financial threat of a failing business or a loss of a job. It's the reputational threat of someone talking negatively about you. Or it's the emotional threat of your child not succeeding in life. With all these things, there is no physical threat in front of you that you need to try to fight or flee. With Dhar Mann, it was the same thing. Right? There was no physical threat in front of him as he sat there at his kitchen table. Instead, it might have been the financial threat of his business not living up to the meteoric level of success that he'd set for himself. That overwhelming stress likely triggered his first panic attack. His body interpreted the stress as danger, and therefore it engaged his fight or flight response. So his body was ready to fight a threat or flee to safety, but there he was just in his kitchen on his computer. His body was prepared to move fast, but there was nowhere to move to. What Dhar Mann didn't know, and what most people don't know, is that these intense sensations were not dangerous. In fact, it was the exact opposite. His body had engaged its defense system, which actually put him in an ultra-protective and safe state. His body was ready to physically defend itself, but since there was no actual danger and no threat present, he instead looked inward at the sensations themselves. He saw his shortness of breath and his racing heart as itself being dangerous. That made him panic even more because he thought he might be having a heart attack or some serious health issue. From there, Dhar Mann continued to have panic attacks for the next month because he became fearful of the panic and the sensations themselves. He was worried about when, where, and how the next panic attack might strike. He was in a fearful state, and that fear was the fuel for his panic attacks. It was signaling to his body to release even more adrenaline and stress hormones, and that was making his panic attacks even worse. But here's the reality. That next month of panic attacks could have been completely avoided. First, Dhar Mann needed to understand that the panic attacks themselves were not harmful. That instead, it was a sign that his body was in a heightened and protective state. Once he understood that the panic attacks weren't harmful, he could have then implemented step number 4 of the fearless approach. So what this means is instead of becoming tense and fearful when the panic attack started, he could have encouraged them to get worse. Yes, I know that sounds counterintuitive, but by trying to make the panic worse, what happens is we send a signal to our prefrontal cortex that there's no threat present and that we're not in any danger. This would have immediately slowed down the release of stress hormones in his body, and Dhar Mann would have stopped having panic attacks either immediately or within a week or so. In other words, if he would have implemented this technique, he would not have spent the next month suffering from panic attack after panic attack. On top of that, Dhar Mann did need to create a better work-life balance, which he did, and he also needed to start exercising and cleaning up his diet, which he also did. But it's worth noting that these things alone don't often cure anxiety. Recovery from anxiety is aided and propelled forward by these things like the nutrients of a healthy diet and incorporating movement into your daily life. But the real cure to anxiety involves losing your fear of it and then gradually desensitizing your nervous system. And all of that is explained in the 5-step cure to anxiety and panic attacks that I've put in the link below. If you enjoyed this video, you'd be doing me a huge favor by hitting the like button before you leave, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.